All right, amazing answer. And next one is were ancient Israelites in the time of Moses, 13th century BC, were they monotheists?
Yeah, I think this is a very important question. In fact, I wrote a whole book about it. In part, the reason I wrote my book, if I may have an advertisement here, my Israelite religions book, which is actually a textbook on that subject, was to discuss this and to both survey the opinions and views of others, but also the evidence inside the Bible and outside the Bible. Of course, if you look at the Bible traces um, people, Israel, as a nation, all the way back to the time of Moses, which, as I've said, is probably the mid 13th century BC, very early. And you can even go back before that in terms of the biblical record, maybe 500 years before that to the time of Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and there you have this revelation of God to them, and they worship that God alone. El Shaddai reveals himself by the name that probably the best guess in terms of pronouncing it is Yahweh, as the name, the personal name of God, certainly during the time of Moses, according to Exodus 3 and Exodus 6. So in the Bible, there is clearly this belief in a single God that is worshipped. The problem is that the God who is worshipped as a single God also demands, at least in the Ten Commandments and certainly after that, that there be no images made of him. So if we look at the archaeology, we don't find explicitly images of the God of Israel, of Yahweh. Certainly not in the Orthodox understanding of Yahweh. Now, there are some images maybe connected with syncretistic tendencies that are found in other cases. So it's hard to know how would you prove if you don't have any texts, and we have virtually very few texts from the early period of Israel, if you outside of the Bible, if you don't have any texts outside of the Bible, and you don't have a single representation of a God, deity in the form of an image, because images are forbidden in the Ten Commandments and later, how are you going to find evidence of there being a single God? And this has puzzled archaeologists. So the tendency has been, and critical scholars, the tendency has been to assume, well, they didn't have an idea of a single God that evolved. And early on, you have many gods. You have the Baals, you have other gods of Canaan, Resheph and whatnot, Asherah, the female goddess. Eol was one of those gods, a high god. Some of them are mentioned at Ugarit in the myths there from the 13th century BC. And you have many gods and goddesses, and then it gradually evolves over time into a single deity, so that by the time of Josiah, in around 620 BC, or some would say even later, in the Hellenistic period, or after in the Persian period after 539 BC, you have this development for various social and political reasons of belief in a single deity, a single God. And then that's informed by the Greeks who have developed this among the philosophers like Plato and others, this philosophy of a single God, and that is to be worshipped. And so the Jews of that time borrow from the Greeks, and they come up with this idea of a single God and monotheism. Now that is, as I say, contrary to the biblical witness, but I think there is also bits and pieces of evidence in the early period of Israel. If you go all the way back to the time of the around 1200 BC, when Israel is just settling in the land, we have both in Deuteronomy 27, 28, thereabouts, and then also in Joshua 8, 30 to 35, we have record of Joshua building an altar, which is commanded in Deuteronomy to be built when Israel comes into the land, and that's to be done on Mount Ebal, and then curses and blessings are to be pronounced. But the altar is to the living God, and it is not to have be built of cut stone or anything else. Well, it's interesting that from around 1200 BC on Mount Ebal, the only site there that has any evidence of human occupation between 2000 BC or maybe a century or two later down to 539 BC in the Persian period, the only site is on Mount Ebal on the third highest peak. There is the remains of what the excavator identified as an altar. And that's very interesting. It's only there for a generation or so, and yet it's there. Is this the altar of Joshua? Well, some think it might be, some think no, but it clearly is an altar built by the people who were occupying the land at that time, which certainly included, maybe dominant in that area, the hill country area, was dominantly that of the Israelites. Now, initially, when this altar was found, and they found about, I don't know, 2,800 bones of animals in and around the altar. Most of these animals were that of animals that were to be sacrificed according to the Leviticus laws and other laws, mostly sheep and goats, occasionally some fallow deer, which some see as at least possible for consumption. They weren't considered unclean, but certainly no pigs, no pig bones, no other bones. But as I say, it was identified as an altar. But many archaeologists and other biblical scholars said, no, this can't be an altar. Why were they so opposed to it? Well, they were opposed to it because there were none of the usual accoutrements that you find in Canaanite religion. There should have been symbols of Baal or Asherah, maybe a standing stone there, maybe images of these figures. There could have been other such, and pig bones as well being sacrificed. None of that was here. And so that led many of the scholars to say, well, this can't be an altar. The problem is there's been no other successful explanation of it. It can't be a watchtower because it's built back from the ridge of the peak. And if it were a watchtower, who's it watching for? Because there's nobody else living on the mountain at that time. It can't be a farmhouse of a single hermit who wanted to get away and live up there, because it doesn't have the profile of what you would expect for a farmhouse of that time. Donkey bones, for example, because you would have donkeys that would have worked there, and other types of implements and what have you. The best explanation, and the one generally accepted to this day, is it's a cult center. It's of unworked stones, which exactly matches Exodus 20:22 and following, which says when you build an altar, it should be of field stones, basically, not of cut stone. And it is a single altar. If people are worshiping multiple gods, they build separate altars to them and sacrifice on each one of those. But here is a single altar to a single God. Very interesting. That's what we have. The degree to which we want to match it up, it has some, seems to me to be somewhat convincing that that's what we have here. And I discussed that in my book, Israelite Religions. And then as we go later on in the period, we see that very early as, yes, it's true, there is evidence of the worship of other gods and goddesses. There's a bowl found about 15 kilometers east of Dothan in a site. Is this a bowl of Ale or Baal or some other god? Possibly. It could also be of Yahweh by a syncretistic group of Israelites who were worshiping other gods. There's nothing surprising about that. That's exactly what the book of Judges says. And all of the historical books speak about how the Israelites constantly turned to other gods. You have it as well in these inscriptions that are found later on in the 9th century, maybe around 800 or earlier, 850 BC. You have at a site in northeastern Sinai, which is probably a bit of a hotel, a caravanserai, as they call it, but also a place where cultic elements and dedications are made. You have I bless written out. You have I bless you to Yahweh and Asherah. And you also have that at least one tomb in Judah. But again, this is no surprise because there are going to be Israelites worshiping other gods and goddesses. If they weren't, then that would contradict what the Bible even says about it. But what is interesting is the earliest texts we have outside of the Bible that can, in any sense, be sort of official texts, which include little notes. What people wrote their notes and letters on at that time were potsherds, and they wrote it with ink. And we have some of those from the 7th and 6th century, early 6th centuries, sent from presumably Jerusalem to the city of Lachish in the west, and in the south to the fortress of Arad. And Lachish was also a major fortification. And it's quite clear that these represent royal or official, at least in part, documentation in which generals and other military officials are writing, talking about the fortress and how well things are going there to make sure. And by the accident of archaeology, we have these found. There were probably many, many more such correspondence in many other places in Judah. But the important thing that I want to mention is that on these records, there's only one God mentioned. Usually at the beginning, they will say, instead of greetings, I hope you're doing well, they will say, may it be peace with you, shalom, may it be well with you by Yahweh. Yahweh is the only God mentioned in all the official correspondence, the only God mentioned in all the inscriptions after 800 BC throughout Israel, throughout Judah. And the names of the people of Israel that we know both from the Bible and also from the seals and sealed impressions, we have hundreds of names now, down to the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem in 586 BC and of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, hundreds of names of Israelites. And the dominant majority by far, and I'm talking here 90% plus, where the name contains the name of a god, and they often did, they would say, blessed by God, or God is faithful. For example, Hezekiah, Yahweh is my strength. Or Josiah, Yahweh is salvation. These kind of confessional names. They're all of Yahweh. There are some of El, which is the shortened form of Elohim, the common word for God, but that could also refer to Yahweh. But it's amazing, these names, they're all of Yahweh. There are one or two among the hundreds that are of other known deities outside of Israel or of Baal, as we have in the early 8th century in the northern kingdom, some Baal names. But that's it. And it can easily be represented as a minority of the population, a very small minority. And by the time we get to the end, it's almost exclusively Yahwistic names. Now, that kind of naming is not found in any of the nearby countries. Ammon, they had their chief god Milcom. Moab had their chief god Chemosh, Edom, Kaus, and so forth. In none of these others where we do have collections of names do you have this kind of dominant percentage of names of the national god. In Israel and Judah, something special was going on different from any of these other places. So this is some evidence that suggests that you can't simply argue that there was this evolutionary development. The other point, while I'm at it, is that if you go back to the time when Israel is leaving Egypt, And a century before that, when Israel is still in slavery in Egypt, this is around the 1360s BC, you have a pharaoh there by the name of Amenophis IV, who changes his name to Akhenaten, because that last part of that name, Akhenaten, the Aten, is the god he worships, the sun disk. And he and his family proceed to make many inscriptions and images of him worshiping, he and his family worshiping just this one God. So the idea of the worship of a single God already existed that early. And therefore, it's by no means impossible, even from the historical comparative studies, that early Israel could have worshipped a single God, and I believe they did. I believe there were always Israelites from the beginning who worshipped other gods, who worshipped a false religion. That's why I titled my book Israelite Religions with an S on the end for the plural form, because that always existed. But as far as you can go back, I believe, consistent with the witness of the Bible, you have the worship of a single God by at least some of the people.
All right, this is best answer I heard on this topic, so this is your field, right? But can you provide textual evidence for from Torah that monotheism is in Pentateuch, or well, we can see in Deutero Isaiah or later texts that monotheism is more clear, but in Torah it's not that clear that other gods do not exist. But what do you say about that?
Yeah. Thank you. I meant to address this a little bit. There's so much in this area to talk about. So the ancient Israelites did not believe or follow necessarily what I would call later Greek philosophical monotheism. Greek philosophical monotheism argues there is one God and there are no other gods, nothing else. There is just a single God. And Isaiah 42, 47, 48, particularly those chapters come as close as any text in the Old Testament to saying all the other gods are nothing. They are zero. Only the true God exists. And this is part of a claim to show that the gods of Babylon and other gods that this text is speaking to are zero. They are of no significance. But early on, I agree with you. I don't think that they were arguing that philosophically, no other gods. They were simply saying there is one God, the creator of heaven and earth, and he is the one that you worship and no other. This God will not allow any other gods to be worshiped. So some people don't call this monotheism, they call it monolatry or other terms that are used to identify the worship of a single God by the people who worship him, but they don't necessarily address the issue of other gods and goddesses in terms of that. They're not saying they exist, they're not saying they don't exist. That's not the focus. The focus is the worship of a single God. And of course, this is found in both Exodus and in Deuteronomy, where in both cases you have not only that you shall not worship other gods, but you also have the statement that that God, and this is why you should observe the Sabbath, because that God created the world. So he's not just a local God to worship as a national God, but also the creator of the heavens and the earth, as Genesis already is saying in Genesis 1. And it's repeating that, and it says that you recognize this by taking one day out of 7 and setting it aside. God has created everything, and he wants you to recognize that by giving him back one day in 7, so that, in fact, you are truly believing that this is the one true God. So I think you have that. Of course, you have that. The most important text is Deuteronomy 6:4, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is our God. The Lord is one. And one, exactly how that is to be understood, there are many different possibilities, but one that really has to stand out is that there is only one God and not multiple gods, and that only one God shall be worshipped and recognized.